So our next speaker we have is going to be having a lecture on the psychology of disease. So this is a wonderful course. It's one of the 19 courses in our program, and it is a course that deals with the mind-body aspect of health and nutrition. So you learn all the foundational principles within the first half of the program, and then there's quite a bit of applied hands-on knowledge in the latter half. So one of the wonderful things about IHN is the hands-on cooking classes. So those are done right in the instructor's home, whether it's online or in person. They're done in the instructor's home, and we have the holistic farm trips as well. So you actually go with your instructor and visit a local farm in your area. If you are online, there is an assignment that is experiential and gets you out in the area so you can explore and really delve into what's happening in your local environment in regards to organic farming, and the herbal walk as well. Okay, beautiful. Hi, Kathrin.
Hi.
Nice to see you today. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Papadopoulos. I'm the director of the Institute of Holistic Nutrition for both the in-class and online programs. Today we have Kathrin Bruner as our second faculty lecturer for our faculty representing the virtual open house for November 2021. And Kathrin Bruner is a Toronto-based nutritionist, health educator, and a Pilates and yoga instructor. She has a passion for holistic living and loves to share that in the clinic, in the classroom, and in the studio. Kathrin holds a degree in psychology and is also a 2012 graduate of the Institute of Holistic Nutrition. She is the co-owner of For the Love of Body and runs interactive workshops and events with an emphasis on hands-on learning. She teaches fermentation, soap making, and how to make natural skincare products and cleaning products. Kathrin teaches nutrition and the environment, the psychology of disease at the Institute of Holistic Nutrition in-class and online programs. She also teaches in our continuing education department the Fermentation Foundations, Traditions, and Trends course. Let's welcome Kathrin Brenner.
Hi, thank you, Elizabeth, for the warm welcome, and welcome to all of you attending the virtual open house. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm going to pull up a presentation to share with you. And today what we're going to be talking about is a concept called the inner critic and how the inner critic is related to our mental health. And the inner critic, when it's amplified in someone or strong in someone, can lead to higher rates of things like anxiety, depression, also issues with stress and emotional regulation. And one of the things that has been found is that the practice of self-compassion is one of the strongest antidotes to an amplified inner critic. And in today's session, we're going to take a look at what is an inner critic, how can we identify it in ourselves. I'll share with you some tools for self-assessment to figure out whether or not your inner critic is amplified. We'll talk about what self-compassion is, and we'll look at some self-compassion practices that are some of my favorites because they're very easy to integrate into everyday life. And they can have a really profound impact on quieting that voice of our inner critic to allow for better emotional and stress resiliency. Now, I wanted to start with this quote by Brene Brown, which many of you may have heard of her before. She's a social worker and researcher and an author. She's also done a number of TED Talks where she has focused on things like being able to set boundaries, on dealing with difficult emotions, especially the emotions of guilt and shame. And this is an excerpt from one of her books called The Gift of Imperfections. And she says, self-compassion is key because when we're able to be gentle with ourselves, in the midst of shame, we're more likely to reach out, connect, and experience empathy. And empathy for ourselves is, of course, really important, the ability to be able to offer ourselves gentleness, but also as health practitioners and nutritionists, perhaps moving into clinical practice, to be able to connect to our clients with empathy is paramount because it's a touchstone of being able to develop what's called a therapeutic relationship or a therapeutic alliance with our clients. And one of the things that the literature has clearly shown is that if we don't have empathy for ourselves, we have a more difficult time showing empathy to other people. And if we can't show empathy to our clients, it's going to be really challenging to create that connection, which is what keeps clients coming back to work with us. Now, when we talk about an inner critic can have a few different names. The inner critic could also be called negative self-talk. For those of you who have maybe taken a psychology course before, if you've been introduced to Freudian concepts, in Freudian terminology, it would be called the superego. And the inner critic, it's the voice inside our heads that might bad talk us, that might demean us, that might try and use, let's say, like negative words or negative tones as a way to try and push an outcome. And I think often the inner critic can be hidden to ourselves because we just have mental chatter happening all day long. And because we have a voice that just offers running commentary all day long, it can sometimes become so normalized that we don't really notice anymore, well, what are the words that are actually being said in my head and how are they being said? And for many of us, if we were to develop some awareness and attention to really noticing what that inner dialogue sounds like, we might notice that there's some thoughts that we have in our head that might be positive. There's thoughts that are running through our head that might be neutral. So maybe that's just helping us to plan our grocery list. And then there's also going to be inner dialogue that's negative. And those of us who have an amplified or a strong inner critic will have a higher portion of these negative thoughts. And the negative thoughts will tend to be on the side of being hurtful or harmful. Now, when we look at inner critics in people, those people who have a strong inner critic will tend to experience higher rates of anxiety and depression. And we're going to take a little look at why the inner critic develops. But one thing that I would encourage in general is to just spend some time thinking throughout the day of trying to notice what your mental chatter is. Because one thing that can sometimes be a little bit of a challenge is that if that dialogue that's just kind of running through our heads all day long is just in the background, we might not have the self-awareness to be able to assess whether or not we have an inner critic that's present or causing us some degree of harm. So the first step is to really notice what that inner dialogue is like to be able to assess the tone and the words that it's using. Now, in terms of why it develops, there's two big reasons why an inner critic develops, and they don't need to be separate. They can exist in the same person. But the one reason why an inner critic might develop is because of perfectionist tendencies. And when we look at perfectionism, this is when someone has a very high degree of expectations for themselves. They might have a very high set of standards. They might expect themselves to execute things perfectly. They might want to be the best at things. They might be very focused on external achievements. That might be getting the A+. That might be having a perfectly tidy home at all times. And that perfectionist tendency is often learned early in life. And that might be that a caretaker, a parent may have taught or instilled the values of perfectionism. And this might be, in examples of perhaps there was a caretaker that praised you for doing a really good job on a test. That's so great, you got 100%. Or maybe you were praised for, let's say, even your appearance. Oh, you look so fantastic in that dress. So we might be rewarded on these external things. So things that aren't about who we are, but rather how we achieve these external things. And if we start to associate being praised with performing well, then we're going to start to strive to perform well all the time. And as we grow older, we're going to start to put higher and higher expectations and standards on ourselves. And we might find that this inner critic develops partially as a tool to keep pushing ourselves, to keep achieving these high expectations, but also as the voice that criticizes us if we don't meet them to our own perceived degree. So this might be, for example, someone who gets mad at themselves for getting a question wrong on the test. This might be the person who isn't able to put their feet up and take a day off because their day off is still filled with a really big to-do list of having to clean all these things and achieve all these things, because we might have a difficult time just resting because we have this huge list and set of expectations that we have of ourselves. We might have a really hard time giving ourselves a break. Brene Brown, she says that perfectionism hampers success and that it's often the path to depression, anxiety, addiction, and life paralysis. And one thing that can often be problematic for people who have perfectionist tendencies is they may worry that if they stop having such a high perfectionist inner voice, that they're going to lose ambition or drive. And they might credit their achievements in life and who they are as a person because they're so hard on themselves, because they expect perfection from themselves. And so if we were to imagine the inner voice or the inner critic voice of a perfectionist, this would be the voice that is always nagging you to be doing something, that's always expecting things to be perfect, that expects you to do more than anybody else, and that gets upset with yourself if you don't achieve that perfection. Another reason why an inner critic can also develop is because of our survival instincts. And when we think about the inner critic in this context, it may have developed in an old part of our brain, so reptilian and mammalian sections of our brains that are very concerned with keeping us safe. And when we look at the areas of the brain that are involved with survival, one of the really big systems involved is called the limbic system. And the limbic system in the brain, it's a collection of different areas of the brain and organs in the brain. It includes the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the hippocampi, and the amygdala. And when we look at the amygdala or amygdala, it is the part of your brain that decides whether or not something could be unsafe. And if the amygdala decides this is a potential threat, it triggers the HPA axis, which is your hypothalamus, your pituitary, and your adrenal glands, to set off a stress response. And that stress response we often call the freeze, fight, or flight response. And so when we have a freeze, flight, or fight response, this is us trying to, in this moment, all systems are like stress hormones going through the body. We have to assess, how can I survive this stressful event? And so we freeze so that we can assess the situation and decide whether or not we should fight or whether or not we should run away. And when this system goes off repeatedly, it starts to become overly sensitive. And so in people whose stress system is going off more often, their amygdala actually becomes sensitive, and it starts to perceive more and more things as potential threats, even when they're not. And if you've experienced a stressful period of time in your life, you might maybe recall back and think about whether or not you maybe had a bigger startle response during that time. For me, things that I notice is if I've had a particularly stressful period of time, my startle reflex is huge. Like that might be when I'm sitting on the couch and I hear a noise outside and I jump, where normally a noise outside wouldn't trigger me. So that's an example of the amygdala becoming overly sensitive during periods of stress. And so for people with this hypervigilant system, the survival system, we are constantly on the lookout for threats. And the inner critic develops as a tool that's used by the survival system to remain alert and to be paying attention in case there's a potential threat around us. And so for individuals whose inner critic voice is really connected to survival, this might be the person that is worrying a lot. This might be the person that is excessively prepared and planning for all things. I'm thinking in my head now of a friend I was chatting with yesterday who's already planned her winter survival kit in her car in the event that her car breaks down and she needs to sleep overnight in her car at the side of the road, which is, preparation is great, but she's already spending a lot of mental energy and worrying about this potential that's far off in the future. It can also look like the ruminating voice. So this could also be the voice that ruminates or that recalls again and again things that went wrong. So this might look like at the end of the day, what goes through your head before you're going to sleep is the argument that you had, and this is what I should have said. And you replay the argument, you think about all the different things you could have said in that moment. That would be an example of ruminating over something that happened during the day. And so when we look at the way that our stress response system is set up, we also know that humans in general have what's called a negativity bias. And the negativity bias is explained sometimes with the analogy of how things stick to us. So when we think about something that's positive that's happened in our day, we can think of that like a Teflon or a nonstick coating. So if I were to imagine something nice happens today, somebody holds the door for me. So that experience happened, and like nonstick coating, like Teflon, it just falls back off me. Versus if I have something negative that happens to me during my day, then we might think of that like Velcro. So that experience happens and it just sticks to me. So at the end of the day, or for many, many minutes of the remainder of the day, I keep replaying it. So let's say the person that cuts me off. And because we have this negativity bias naturally, if you're somebody that's prone to an inner critic voice that's connected to this hypervigilant survival system, you might tend to really be on that side of chronic rumination over things. And so for people who have this, we will tend to see a lot of stress dysregulation. So the system that's running in overdrive. And because the stress response system is part of the limbic system, we also tend to see emotional dysregulation because the limbic system is also the area in the brain where we process, where we store, and where we generate emotional responses. So we might also see that for individuals with a strong inner critic, they might tend to have a very exaggerated response to emotion, meaning that their emotions can tend to overwhelm them. So for example, with our perfectionist, if they don't do well on a test, their emotional response to that will be much greater than somebody whose inner critic voice is balanced. They might not do well on a test, and that might not produce a strong emotional reaction. Or if it does, it's very temporary and transitory and they move on. Whereas the perfectionist might be thinking about this for a long time, and those emotions might feel really overwhelming. Similarly, for our survival inner critic, For this person, because they're going to tend to experience a lot of these survival-driven emotional responses, they're going to tend to respond very strongly to the emotions of fear and anger, because these are emotions that are really dominant where we're running this fight, flight, freeze response system. Now, in terms of thinking about our own inner critics, some questions that we might ask ourselves to determine whether or not this is something that we're experiencing is to think about some of the ways that we might judge ourselves. So do you judge yourself on things like your appearance, on things like your performance? Do you judge yourself in terms of your career, in terms of where you are compared to other people in your peer group? Do you tend to expect more of yourself than you would of others? Do you value perfectionism and external rewards or receiving praise from people? Do you set realistic goals and timelines? And often people who have a strong inner critic will tend to take on too much, and they'll tend to overestimate how quickly they can get things done. So it's really common for people with a strong inner critic to feel busy because they might overextend themselves and have a really long to-do list. For some people with a strong inner critic voice, they might actually expect less of themselves than they would of other people. And this might be for our individuals who have that strong survival inner critic, where in an effort to protect themselves, they may negatively talk to themselves like they're not good enough or don't try because you might get hurt if you try this. So we might actually hold ourselves back because we talk to ourselves in a way that's degrading or demeaning of our own abilities. And so we hold ourselves back. Do you accept yourself as you are in this moment? Do you put yourself down in front of others? So in terms of thinking about this one, we might find ourselves being uncomfortable with receiving a compliment. Right? So this again might be the person who is, let's say someone says, I don't know, something about, you did really well today, immediately having to say, no, I didn't. Oh, I really messed up the blah, 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 blah. Like immediately having to shy away from a compliment, immediately having to put ourselves down because again, the survival negative self-talk might be kicking in. We might find that some people with a strong inner critic voice actually use this self-criticism in order to motivate themselves to do something. So it might be like, if I don't yell at myself in my head, if I don't berate myself in my head, then I'm not going to do it. And typically procrastinators will sometimes use this. So if I, in my head, talk to myself negatively, that's going to be what makes me finish this because otherwise I won't. And then finally, are you worthy of love? And this is a big question. And this is one where Brene Brown's work really focuses and moves around this question of self-worth and being worthy of receiving love. And this is often, I think, again, one in our culture that can be a problematic one because in a lot of our social exposure, we might be fed stories or cultural narratives where we see modeled in front of us people receiving a reward because of how they look or what they've done or what they've achieved. So Disney, I blame you for some of this. But also when we think about even just pop culture and Hollywood movies and all of these sort of cultural story narratives that we're exposed to throughout our life, where you have to have achieved a certain appearance or you have to have achieved a certain thing in order to then be worthy of the love interest. versus you with all your imperfections as you are in this moment without needing to change, without needing to be better, are worthy of love. And that's a real critical piece of being able to get over an inner critic, but also in terms of being able to find self-empathy. Other things that we might also notice when we start to pay attention to that inner negative self-talk is that beyond just the expectation or the actual words or sentences being spoken, we might also, when we start to listen to our own mental dialogue, notice that we might have a different tone of voice with ourselves than we would if we were speaking to a loved one. And I often think about this. For me, being hard on yourself was something that was modeled by my parents, and it was modeled as a way to enforce being a hard worker. And my father was a perfectionist. And so I was also taught to try and emulate my father and be a perfectionist. But in my family home, it's very common that if somebody makes a mistake, they'll out loud say, "Oh, I'm such an idiot," or "Oh, I'm such a dummy for doing this." And so this berating ourselves for mistakes. And for many of us, we might not do this aloud. You might do it aloud, but for many of us, that will be more common or very amplified in our own heads. We might also use language in our own heads that's harsh or mean or derogatory that we wouldn't use, again, to a loved one. We might also feel out of control, meaning that you might have thoughts that you know are making you feel bad, but you can't help but think them. So you might feel like that inner voice that's inside your head, you don't have control over it. And for people where that inner voice feels out of your control, so let's say even that voice where you can't rest at the end of the workday, or you can't rest on a day off. It's just telling you to keep doing things and to keep busy. It's berating you for taking some time to just lay on the couch and do nothing. You can't turn it off. We might find that for individuals who are experiencing this, they might try to use distraction to get that voice to finally be quiet. And that might mean that we are, let's say, using alcohol to quiet that voice down, to be able to relax and turn off the workday or let go of the stress of the day. We might be using things like having a sound on in the background all the time. So always having a podcast playing, or always turning the TV on, or like a show on, to be able to just have a break from the inner dialogue. And that can, over time, start to lead to a lot of mental tension. Because one of the things that the psychological literature shows very clearly is that when we deny or ignore what's happening in this mental landscape, when we suppress negative emotions, it actually amplifies them. It makes them be felt much more strongly, and those effects on our body last a lot longer. And so that distraction, even though it might feel good in the moment, in the long run is maybe leading to stress and emotional dysregulation. Other things that I think sometimes can also be very different in our inner voice is just the tone that we might be using. And I've studied nonviolent communication a number of times. And in nonviolent communication, one of the first exercises they often teach is to literally spend a period of time saying out loud the thoughts that are running through your head, just to start to get to know what that mental dialogue is like. And I can remember the first time that I tried doing this exercise, and it was really powerful to notice how much of my mental dialogue was really quite mean. And there's no way I would have spoken to a loved one in the same tone with the same words that I was using in my own head. So it can be a very useful exercise to try. So when we think about this inner critic and tools to overcome it, self-compassion is one of the best tools that we can generate to get over this inner critic. And self-compassion is essentially being able to offer yourself empathy, to recognize your own worth without having to do something to earn it. Self-compassion, we are worthy of it because all people are worthy of self-compassion. And so part of the practice of self-compassion that we'll see is recognizing our shared humanity. When we start to practice self-compassion, it leads to better emotional resiliency, more accurate self-concepts, and being able to give more kindness to ourselves and to other people. Self-compassion is not self-indulgence. And I think sometimes with self-compassion, there can be this misconception or this negative stereotype that if we're self-compassionate, we're being self-indulgent or we're coddling ourselves. And being compassionate to ourselves is not babying ourselves. It's self-care, it's self-soothing, and it's important for our mental health. Self-compassion is also not self-esteem. And self-esteem is a reflection of our perceived achievements and our self-perception of our likability. So self-esteem is when you think about, let's say, joining a group or taking a new position somewhere. Self-esteem would be connected to feeling like, what do I bring to the table based on my achievements? And will people like me based on that? And so self-esteem is very much attuned to the external and other people's impressions of you, which also means that people who rate very high in self-esteem are actually more prone to self-distortion. So these will be people who try and change themselves to please other people, who tend to respond to peer pressure. And because their feeling of their own worth is so tied to what other people think, it's also very fragile. And so often people who have really high self-esteem will tend to have higher rates of anxiety and depression. When we look at self-compassion, it has three big elements: self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. And so we're going to take a look at what these three are and how we can practice them in our everyday life. So with self-kindness, this is the idea of being gentle with ourselves, even when we fail or feel inadequate. Shared humanity is recognizing that suffering and imperfection is common to all humans. Mindfulness is a practice that seeks to openly notice everything that's appearing in our awareness and to notice it without judgment. It's attuning to what's arising in the present moment with equanimity, meaning that you can notice something that's happening without getting lost in an analysis of it or in the emotional reaction to it. Now, when we practice self-kindness, there's a few different ways that we can do this. One of the ways for encouraging self-kindness can be to imagine that you were speaking with a loved one. Can you, in that voice that you use in your own head, talk to yourself in the same way that you would talk to your best friend? We can also practice self-kindness by stimulating the release of positive neurotransmitters and hormones in our bodies. And one that can be really powerful is oxytocin. This can be released really easily by hugging ourselves or even just placing hands on top of our body. And if you're not driving right now, you might actually try that and just place hands on top of your chest, a hand on top of your rib cage, and just feel your hands on your own body. And this can be a really powerful tool because it's changing the hormones that you release. And by flooding oxytocin through your system, you actually help to turn off those stress response pathways. And when you turn off the stress response pathways, you stay in a part of your brain that's not that survival brain, but it's your higher brain, it's your neocortex. And this is where empathy and compassion live. And so especially if we're feeling stressed or overwhelmed, for people who have that strong, maybe survival linked inner critic, learning how to self-touch as a tool to self-soothe can be a really great way to change what's happening inside your body, which will then change the nature of your thoughts. In terms of practicing the shared humanity is this recognition that, again, all of us as humans have imperfections, all of us experience challenges, and that failure is a natural part of growth. And I think, again, sometimes with shared humanity, it can be good to imagine, again, a friend or a loved one. Like, you don't expect your friends to be perfect. And if you don't expect them to be perfect, then why would you treat yourself differently? So this can be a practice that's especially profound for somebody who has that perfectionist inner critic voice. And when we think about the word compassion, compassion is being able to commiserate with somebody. And the root of the word compassion actually means to share in suffering. And I think that's also something that's important, because often with perfection, we want things to be ideal all the time. And that is not a reality of life. Life has ups and it has downs. And if we're so focused on the up, we're so focused on the perfection, then we are inevitably going to be let down, and we're going to experience all the emotional turmoil that comes with that. But if we recognize that part of this shared humanity is that there are periods of downs, there are periods of emotions that are going to be in response to things that were perceived negatives, then we can allow that to be part of what is life. For me, I really find that by exercising compassion towards other people, it becomes easier to be compassionate on myself. And so when I really think about being there for friends and loved ones, listening to them, not just being there for their highs, but connecting to them and checking in with them when they're having a hard time, just staying in that compassionate place. And then for mindfulness I find is a really important practice to develop along with self-compassion, because with this ability to connect to shared humanity, this ability to be with both the positive and the negative, that's what mindfulness is all about. Mindfulness is being open to what's happening right now in the present moment without attachment. Through this ability to strengthen our awareness, it allows us to notice that we are not our thoughts and we are not our emotions. They appear and they disappear. And that ability to create equanimity or some distance from what's happening in this inner dialogue can sometimes also be a really fantastic tool to be able to not get swept up in the thoughts, to be able to not get carried away and overwhelmed with the emotion, this ability to create some distance. In terms of some exercises that I personally really like, that I find work well, one is name the critic. And name the critic, similar to our mindfulness in terms of trying to create that distance or that space around what's happening. With naming the critic, you might literally create like a cast of characters in your head. So if we think about that inner dialogue, when we notice that inner critic come up, we might think, okay, yeah, this is the judge. This is the judgy voice in my head. Or we might notice like, oh no, this isn't the judge. This is the director. This is the bossy director that's trying to tell me what to do. And by giving this like cast of characters, like you were directing a movie, to these different voices in your head, similar to mindfulness, it creates distance. And when we can create distance, we all of a sudden are no longer in that voice. We are an observer of the voice. And that can allow us to find control and not get swept away. Number two, talking to yourself as you would a friend. And so again, spending some time during the day and thinking about paying attention to the way that your inner voice, your inner dialogue comes up, and making it be the same types of words, the same tone, the same sensitivity, the same compassion that you would use if you were talking to a friend. Number three, practicing empathy. And for practicing empathy, one of the ways that I find that it can be really accessible, and we're often naturally drawn to it, is to sometimes take it to animals. Well, for a lot of us, we have an easier time showing empathy to animals. It's also why animals are so commonly used in therapy, especially for stress dysregulation disorders. So we can probably think about YouTube accounts, social media accounts where we have good news stories of animals being rescued or animals making friends with other species and connecting, but finding this ability to feel empathy with animals can be one that's a really easy one to foster. And as empathy becomes easier to practice, then we might start to think about keeping our empathy turned on for other stories and events that come across our news feeds. And I find often, especially with the news, it can tend to be so often overwhelmingly negative that we tend to numb out or shut down or avoid. And although that might seem like a self-preservation strategy, it is turning down our empathy. So can we eventually take in those stories of the world or those hardships that we see in our communities and handle them with empathy, because we've developed the skill to be able to hold space, to feel emotion, but not let emotion carry us away. Number four, soothing touch. So again, as I mentioned, just placing hands on the body can be incredibly therapeutic. This is also where things like a weighted blanket, some of you may have seen these before. They're used very commonly for adults, children, and for pets actually, to help to soothe anxiety and promote better rest and sleep. But we can also think about things like self-massage. So one thing that I do every day is when I'm washing my face at the end of the day, I just massage as I'm doing it. And it's something that only takes a few minutes, but it reminds me that I'm worth that time, that I deserve to feel nice. And it just is this little pocket of self-care that's wrapped up into something that I do every day. You might also experience soothing touch with something or someone else. So don't underestimate having something like a stuffed animal, like the baby blanket, like that's actually something that's a tool for self-soothing. If you have a favorite cuddly pillow on the couch, cuddle up with it. Like all of these different tools for enacting that soothing touch turn down that stress response system. They allow us to stay regulated. Number five, connect to your senses. This is something that's really fantastic, especially for people who are in that more survival inner dialogue, because when we are in that stress response system, we tend to shut down the noticing of our senses. And there's properties of proprioception and interoception, which means just noticing where your body is in space and noticing the sensations that your body is giving you. And when we develop this noticing of senses, it helps to turn off the stress response system. And this could be things like having a warm bath, using essential oils, going for a walk outside in nature and noticing the air, noticing the colors of green, smells. But all of this like noticing tactile senses can be really fantastic for being in the moment and getting around that inner critic voice. And then finally, a self-compassion journal. And self-compassion journals can be something that's done, and it doesn't need to take a long period of time. It can be spending a few minutes at the beginning or the end of the day, just jotting down maybe some intentions or affirmations around being gentle on yourself today. Maybe you're writing a few sentences that really embody that speaking to yourself as you would a loved one. Maybe it's about being okay if you had a day where your inner critic or your perfectionist, roared up, being able to forgive yourself for that, but starting to just develop this practice of doing self-compassion more regularly. And as you develop that practice, the more easy and the more intuitive or the more natural it becomes. Okay. So that was a little introduction to the inner critic and self-compassion. Are there any questions?
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Kathrin. That was very soothing, very loving, and some beautiful recommendations there. Thank you so much. So we have a question here. How does interoception work to calm the mind?
Enteroception refers to your brain's noticing of internal stimuli. So that can be things like touch receptors, noticing the temperature, the taste in your mouth. And interoception, or these felt sensations of inside of our body, it ends up activating a part of our brain that turns down the stress response pathway. And so essentially, if I was in a fight, flight, or freeze situation, then I'm just trying to survive. So whether or not I notice that the air is slightly damp, that wouldn't be a priority. It would be survival. And so if I take my awareness to notice, oh, my belly's rumbling a little bit, maybe I'm hungry. Oh, it got a little cool in the room. Or like, oh, I can really feel my feet in contact with the floor. Then that's telling my nervous system, oh, I must be safe. There's also like really specific exercises, and we get into this in the psychology of disease. For example, when you're running away from something, you're on your tippy toes. So if you think about really pressing your heels down into the floor, that can be a way, again, of telling your nervous system, I must be safe. My heels are in contact with the ground. So these are some of the different types of ways that we can be really specific with interoception, where we're stimulating the parts of our nervous system that our nervous system understands this would only be stimulated if I was relaxed and safe.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. What an amazing lecture that was. We have some feedback for you. And is Kathrin the only teacher who teaches this course, the Psychology of Disease? We do have well, Kathrin does teach it at our Toronto and Mississauga and online programs. And we do have other faculty members as well with Vancouver and Ottawa that teach Psychology of Disease as well. Okay. So I think that was all of the questions for you, Kathrin.
Well, thank you everyone for attending, and I hope you enjoy the last session.
Thank you so much, Kathrin. Have a beautiful rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye.